Good evening. Yes, good evening. Thank you for that. Thank you, Omar and Leslie, for the welcome and the introduction and for making it possible for us to be with you tonight. It's really fantastic to see some familiar faces and to make some new friends. We're going to organize our time in the presentation part tonight in 4 chapters. So the first will be myself giving a sort of introduction, kind of catching us all up to what we've been involved in. And then we'll move into a discussion about the particular conjuncture that we find ourselves in terms of organizing against gentrification. And Leonardo will be giving some notes and thoughts on that. And then Anne will walk us through how the practices that we're involved in Los Angeles are understood as both building and defending community. And then the 4th chapter will sort of do a little round robin, a little bouncing back and forth, thinking about where are the openings, the windows, the cracks in our current organizing that might help us understand where we can start to open further in a discussion and in action regarding the trajectory of dual power. So let me begin with some just basic introductions. Some of you will be familiar with some of this stuff. I just want to get us all to the point of the question that we are sort of ending with, which is the dual power question. I put that up front because often when we're talking about gentrification, we're talking about the past. We're talking about the sort of fight against the forgetting of the past and the fight to preserve the present. We oftentimes don't have an opportunity to talk about the future. So we want to get to that, and maybe that will help in your conversations to come. So I'm just going to put this up here. It's one of my favorite quotes. To help sort of think about, as artists, how we sort of situate ourselves in the current conjuncture. This quote from Peter Schumann from Bread and Puppet I find particularly compelling because of this question of at what point do our practices, are they applied to the historical situation? Which is a little different than making art about something, making art that is a critique, but actually bringing the questions of material transformation, the questions of process, to the current historical situation. And for us, the historical situation would be the sort of combination of social cleansing of working class and poor communities in cities across the world under the name of gentrification. So that process of social cleansing in our city, Los Angeles, in your city, New York, that social cleansing is happening under liberal, if not progressive, governments. At the same time, an emergence of neo-fascism. So we're at a particular moment where working class, immigrant, communities of color that have historically resisted fascism, are the very urban communities that are being socially cleansed from cities by often progressive governments. For the poor, they don't see these two things as separate. So as we think about how we apply and how we bring the questions of material transformation and process to the historical situation, this is the situation for us. I'll do a little history lesson. So myself, as mentioned, I have a background in HIV/AIDS activism. You'll see on the left that lovely little Twinkie kid, that's me with the jacket. That was our first day of doing needle exchange in Los Angeles. Out of the ACT UP chapter in LA, we started the needle exchange program to bring harm reduction services to people who inject drugs. The majority of folks are folks who live outdoors, who are unhoused. Around the same time, Ultra Red was started by Marco Larson, myself, and Pablo Garcia. Again, at that moment, we were just interested in techno. That's really all we cared about. But we were also interested in making field recordings of the needle exchange sites. It began as a sort of way to document always the possibility of police arrests. Like there you see the police pulling up, expressing their concern for our safety. So recording the exchange was a way to provide some level of documentation should we be hauled into the courts, but it was also a way to make sure that folks didn't feel that they were being surveilled, which they would have felt with a video camera. So we had all these recordings. We started to ask, what can we do with these recordings? Around 1997, late 96, 97, we had an opportunity we had an invitation to visit Pico Aliso, which is the largest concentration of public housing in west of the Mississippi, on the eastern banks of the LA River across from downtown Los Angeles. That's Leonardo's back right there. Right? Isn't that awesome? With that video camera. So we were invited to visit the public housing projects that were being subjected to the demolition under the Bill Clinton administration. There was a federal program called Hope 6, which was a program to demolish public housing as a way to fund public housing. So the neoliberal project under Clinton. Leonardo will talk a little more about that. We were there. We were trying to understand the relationship between global finance capital and changes that were already by then occurring in the city. And Leonardo said, if you want to see where it's being manifest, come to Boyle Heights. We made an album based on the field recordings that we made from that time, from the struggle that the community was engaged in to defend their housing. As bands, you have to have publicity shots. So this is our publicity shot. It's ridiculous, but it's funny. I love it. So there you can see the public housing. That field used to be all public housing. And at that time, again, the question for us was a classic question that artists ask, which is how to organize your materials, how to organize what you were collecting as your materials. But by the time Ultra Red started to grow larger, to now we're about 12 people made up of research teams in Berlin, the UK, New York, and Los Angeles. The question became no longer just about organizing sounds as a sound art collective, but how do we organize listening? And the question of organizing listening allowed us to sort of more directly engage the problems, the historic problems, regarding popular education and the histories of popular education. Around 2010, Ultra Red as a network of these research teams, we made a decision that we wanted to instead of keep growing, we wanted to develop relationships, long-term collaborative relationships in a kind of pedagogical framework to explore like the relationship between popular education and organizing. First out of the gate was London. So the London group, they had an invitation to teach a class at Goldsmiths. So they organized a class called School of Echoes. Okay, they organized a class called School of Echoes. Once the term was over, the project ended. The second group was out of Berlin. They had funding from a left-wing foundation to engage a group of youth who were a part of a struggle to re-communalize public housing. Once the foundation support ended, the project ended. Last is Vogology, or the Ballroom Freedom School here in New York City. That work is still continuing. We have Robert in the house. I don't think you'll mind me saying, the Ballroom Freedom School has had to form a number of relationships with different institutions and funding sources, and oftentimes they find themselves serving those institutions and funding sources as opposed to pursuing the political education work that they feel they're charged to do. So in Los Angeles, we were the last. We decided to go for it without any funding, without any institutional support, and far away from cultural institutions. Our question that we brought together a group of people to ask was, what are we hearing are the issues in our community? It's a question everyone in this room who is engaged in any kind of work to organize the people around you, it's a question we all ask. What are you hearing are the issues in your community? It's just a basic place to start. It's a place to situate your relationship as a listener, but also in the issue, in the problem, as opposed to outside of it. very quickly in the work that we were doing and just talking to community people, organizations, what came up over and over and over again across the city was gentrification. The issue that most people wanted to talk about was changing of the neighborhoods, was social cleansing. So we just started to convene monthly meetings as a group. This is a little deceptive. We're not that big. Really small, very intimate. We just sit around eating pupusas, but meeting on a monthly basis and engaging research. And asking this question, what does gentrification even mean? This is a more recent photo of the group. Anne here, she joined School of Echoes in 2017. So for us, we sort of wanted to arrive at a definition of gentrification that was usable, understandable, and not bogged down in history or in academic speak, I should say. So we just use the definition that gentrification is the displacement and replacement of the poor for profit. That allows us to do a couple things. One, it allows us to sort of talk about these processes of displacement and replacement. It's not just displacement, it's also replacement. And it also allows us to name who the subject or the protagonist is of the struggle, and that's the poor. In our analysis, looking at the different actors who have a role in the drama of social cleansing and the drama of gentrification, looking at everyone that you would imagine from finance capital to city governments to the police to nonprofit organizations to arts organizations, also looking at the role of tenants. In the city of Los Angeles, we have a rent control ordinance, but most people don't even know that it exists. They don't know what it means, they don't know what it entitles them to. And if they don't know what rent protections they have, they're vulnerable. And if they're not organized, they're especially vulnerable. They think it's only happening to them. So for us, one way to fight gentrification was to begin to do tenants' rights workshops. We did 2. Because what we realized very quickly was after just 2 workshops, unless there's a movement in which people can then organize the defense of community, it's very difficult. People remain isolated. Unless there's a movement to actually put the fear of God in the landlords and the developers, it's very difficult to exercise their rights. And unless there's a movement, it's very difficult to expand the legal protections that we actually need in order to keep communities together. And it was in that context that we decided to start to organize the Los Angeles Tenants Union. So we'll talk a little more about the Tenants Union. I'll simply say it's important to remember School of Echoes, beginning with just the 4 of us in Ultra Red in Los Angeles, organizing a larger circle of School of Echoes, and then through research and meeting on a consistent and regular basis, and in a place where we were in relationship to struggles, understanding what was at stake. That what's at stake isn't simply about someone being forced to make a choice. What's at stake is the obliteration of entire communities, history, mental health, and wellness. That level of crisis is, personally for me, it's very familiar. Some of us in the room who are a little older, we remember that level of crisis. And so when you have that intensity of a crisis, the question is, again, how does art respond to this historical situation? And does it even look like art? I'm going to turn over to Leonardo. Oh, Leonardo has a little frog in his voice.
I have to apologize. My voice sucks. Can you understand me? What? Naming the moment. I think it's important to. Understand the situation that we're in. This is very okay. We all have already know what are the effects of the institutions and the relationships and the moment that has on the poor right now. For the residents of the housing projects, we've been at war of displacement to stay in our same place for 30 years. So it's important not to look at just at the corporations or just at big capital. We need to understand that the relationships that already exist, government, non-profits, community leadership, politicians are, will receive the effects of this, of what they do. We really understand what are the effects of these relationships. So we don't need to understand those relationships. Well, while it's important to understand the relationships, we don't need to depend on affecting those relationships. At the same time, it's not important to think of the intentions of people or institutions. We need to pay attention to the effects. There's a lot of good intentioned people who are doing really bad stuff in our communities. So intentions don't matter, effects matter. And we need to have a perspective. We need to be sitting down on a specific place. For the tenants union, the place is the place of the poor in struggle. For the residents of Pico Gardens, the largest housing project, for the residents of Pico Gardens, the poorest, one of the largest housing project west of the Mississippi, and one of the highest concentrations of poverty in Los Angeles, we've seen how little by little good intentions end up in displacement. The median income of the people who live in Los Angeles is, actually I'm gonna skip this slide because it doesn't help. The median income of people of both heights is $34,000 a year. For the people who live in the projects, we're talking about people who make between $10,000 and $20,000 a year. From 1996 to 2002, about 2,000 people were displaced out of that in the community. This is the community right next to downtown, and this is the people in struggle. The people who were displaced were about 2,000 families. 685 families out of public housing in Pico Aliso Village, 281 in Pico Gardens, then 65 families to the construction of the police station, and 250 families with the expansion of the Metro Railway. All of these public investment projects that's supposed to and meant to improve the community. The demolition of the public housing was the demolition of public housing to improve housing in the community, but ended up displacing about 1,100 families. So these good intentions, the intentionality had nothing to do with the effects. The effects was displacement. So for the residents who for 30 years have been fighting, there is no news. The intentions and the relationships that are existing in the neighborhood are meant to displace people. So today I just want to pay attention a little bit to the nonprofits. About 2,000 families were displaced, about 2,000 units of housing were destroyed. This is what's proposed in affordable housing to be built in Boyle Heights. It's about 280 units to replace 2,000 units. Most of this housing goes to people who make from $50,000 to $100,000 a year. The people who make $10,000 to $25,000 will not make it into this housing. On top of that, this housing is not just for the people in Boyle Heights, it's for people who live all across the city. They're competing with the whole city to get housing back into their neighborhood. So the good intentions of not-profit affordable housing don't matter. The good intentions of the foundation who supports this housing doesn't matter. And the good intentions of the politician who tells you that he's gonna bring affordable housing to the community doesn't matter. And understanding that has been an ongoing historical process in our community is very important. So for us, the moment is a moment of struggle, and it's a moment to push back. And we believe that that's the moment, the same moment is being lived across the country, everywhere. We don't need to understand how best to do it through these relationships. We need to change those relationships, and we need to find a different place of struggle. And for us, the place of struggle is the poor. Just one more example. The housing that's been built in affordable housing in Los Angeles is for the top part of this list of the people from $50,000 to $200,000 a year. But the housing where we need it is right here, at the bottom of the pile. Nobody is building that housing. In the meantime, as we're gonna speak later, renters are being displaced, and everybody's making the promise of affordable housing to our communities. So we don't need to wait for these relationships to solve the problem. They're not solving the problem, they're making it worse. And if we understand that, then we understand that we cannot solve this just through the electoral process, through policy making, and through affordable housing development, because we already know the effect. So we have to fight. So in 2002, when we went to the affordable housing developer, which some of us were part of the foundation of it, we told them, you're about to displace 40 families to build 120 units of housing that are affordable. What are you going to do about these 40 families? They told us, well, some people have to sacrifice. The middle class promise of affordable housing is sacrificing the poor, and is selling a middle class dream to the middle class that they will not be able to achieve. So the middle class promise is sacrificing the most poor. And that's what the affordable developer housing promoter that we're working with, who was our friend, told us, too bad, some people have to sacrifice. So we have to fight. And our community, through the Eastside Local, decided to organize and go and say, we don't want affordable housing in our community. Everybody and their grandmother got really upset with us. All the newspaper attacked us, all the nonprofits called us, making hate calls to our community, to our staff, and our members. Whenever they were in the meeting with the affordable housing developer or the politicians or everybody, were told, you don't know what you're doing it all wrong. A very moralist attitude, because they had dared to cross the line and attack the nonprofit. But when they attacked the nonprofit, everybody started attacking the community. So the community had to fight back. In a very protracted struggle through press, shaming, and organizing, and major disruption, our members went to all the affordable housing development meetings in Los Angeles, in Boyle Heights, and started saying, we don't like the affordable housing. This affordable housing is bad. We started asking people for their own income and whether they qualify for the housing. We asked them, how many houses of units are you making? And they were just shaming them until the government went and told the affordable housing, you have to negotiate with these people because you're ruining it for everybody else. So our residents got a contract to come back to their housing with the same conditions and rent as what they used to have. But the problem is this, you don't solve that in a little island, in a little oasis of struggle, and that's why we need the Los Angeles Tenants Union. But to go back to the moment, we already know the effects of all these relationships at the social, political, and economic level, and we already know the ideology. It's the promise of a middle-class dream that sacrifices the most poor. So the coming of together of the Tenants Union is the poor fighting for their own housing in their own terms with their own definition of housing.
That's me. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about another tenant struggle that our local and the larger tenants union was involved in, the mariachi rent strike of last year. So some basic background. This is a building on 2nd Street in Boyle Heights. It's right off of Mariachi Plaza, which Leonardo showed a picture of earlier, right by the metro stop. It's a couple of blocks from my house. And this building was purchased by a new landlord, and he immediately raised the rent between 60 and 80% for not all of the tenants, but a lot of them, which is a pretty common tactic to sort of evict people in phases. And so, obviously that's a form of eviction because most people, particularly poor tenants, can't afford an overnight rate, rent hike of $800 to $1,000. And all of this is legal because they weren't under rent control. So the tenants who were in that building had been there and in the neighborhood, many of them for decades, and a lot of them, not all of them, but a good percentage of them are mariachis. And so, to give a context of what the impact of that is, what the outcome of evicting these tenants, the way that mariachis work is they go to Mariachi Plaza and people hire them there. So being displaced from their homes and their communities also mean that they have no way of working. So, that was a really aggressive and scary situation. The landlord also, and something that we see pretty commonly, we saw he had created a website. He was planning to rename the building Mariachi Crossing and basically take the culture and history of these tenants and use it to sell the building at these greatly increased rents to people from outside of the community while cleansing it of the actual mariachis. So the tenants formed a tenants association. They went on rent strike for nearly a year and they won. So they got to stay in their homes with a 3.5-year contract with caps on rent increases and a commitment to meet with the landlord to renegotiate at the end of that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the implications of that rent strike and some of the unique features of it. But I want to talk a little bit too about why a rent strike basically, and so what the potential of that is. And, I think for me, the reason that a rent strike was a really exciting fight to engage in and a really exciting strategy at the outset and now moving forward too, is it's a reminder, as Leonardo was mentioning too, that the path to winning these struggles is not through the legal system, the electoral system, the policy system, because these tenants, it sort of called into or highlighted the fact that there was no legal recourse. Everything the landlord was doing was legal. It was cruel, but it was completely legal. Rent strikes, I think, really fundamentally call into question just the role of landlords and the power dynamic and the parasitic nature of them, and a lot of aspects of that relationship and dynamic that we naturalize. It's just a reminder that, if you stop paying rent, the building doesn't disappear. The landlord isn't doing anything. Landlords provide nothing. They just extract profit. There's the fact that rent strikes require solidarity and unity to be effective. It's not something you can do alone. You have to do it with your neighbors. You have to organize with your neighbors in order for it to work, which is very different than a lot of the kind of, more like legal and policy-based solution, which is one person going to court. That gets back to, I think, what Dawn was saying about, what does it mean to give a legal clinic and give people these options if there's not a larger movement? It also forces really direct and personal contact. One of the things that we saw the landlord doing initially, and we see a lot of landlords doing, is just trying to put as many degrees of separation and mediation as possible between himself and the tenants, so refusing to meet with them. It took a really long time to find out his name, because they're not required to tell you their names. So there was just like an LLC that was shady. Nobody knew what it was, where it was. And that became, a really big feature of this fight, was kind of making it really personal and forcing the landlord to actually sit down face to face with the tenants and interact with them as human beings. So, do I have another one? So looking at some of the particular aspects of this rent strike that, we've been trying to highlight, we're trying to highlight during it and then afterwards as we're learning from the struggle. One was that there were escalating tactics to put pressure on the landlord. So starting with sort of, direct actions in the community. This is a picture of a kind of march that we took through Boyle Heights that's in Mariachi Plaza and kind of around the neighborhood, which was mainly to demonstrate solidarity within the neighborhood and build community support. We did... Here, I'll go to that one and then go back. Basically, once we found out his name and face, kind of engaging in a lot of, intense public shaming, essentially, so that he was trying to hide behind this LLC and kind of, again, like really distance himself and mediate what the actions that he was taking and the effect that he was having. We also went, brought the fight to his house, literally. So we went from Boyle Heights to his house in Beverly Hills. We had protests and actions there. We camped out in his yard one night. So he couldn't just ignore it. It wasn't something that was happening from far away. Another really important thing was that there was, a lot of unity within the building and the tenants association. So all of the tenants in the building joined the TA, including the ones who hadn't received the rent increase. And that was a really important kind of, I think shift in consciousness, was just people knowing pretty quickly and seeing what was happening in the community and recognizing, just because I didn't receive this rent increase, it's coming for me tomorrow. It makes sense for us to all come together. And then building solidarity and support from outside the building and the tenants association. So building support within the community of Boyle Heights, within the East Side Local. So, members of the East Side Local were supporting who didn't live in the building, including myself. Other members within the tenants union, and then other organizations from outside the tenants union were supporting as well. And keeping this connection to the larger movement too. So another really important feature of the agreement that the tenants made with each other, before undertaking this rent strike, was that they joined the tenants union, so that they weren't just a building organizing in isolation. They all became members of the tenants union and started to identify as part of this larger struggle. And so here's some more pictures of some actions, speeches. And then, so looking at kind of the aftermath and what happened next, this is just a picture from one of our, our general meetings of the tenants union, where the various folks who were living in the building and involved in organizing, some of the lawyers who helped. There was a legal component, but it wasn't about the legality of them staying. It was about the legality, protecting the legality of the rent strike as an act of free speech, which is an important distinction. And so this has now kind of become in some ways like the standard, which is really interesting, looking at some of the headlines that have come up and how people are looking at, what this means for tenants organizing. There have been a lot of rent strikes that kind of came up in the wake of this. At one point, we had 6 within the tenants union. So this is a picture of another rent strike in Highland Park, which is another gentrifying neighborhood in Northeast.